Good afternoon. What will your life be like in 5 years? Without free expression and our First Amendment rights, it may not matter. That's the title of the panel that we will be discussing today. And when the Freedom of Expression Division realized the magnitude of that question, we decided we needed to bring in leading scholars from all areas of communication and do a counterpoint to see if we cannot get a full picture. This evening, that's what we will be doing. We have with us Linda Putnam from UC Santa Barbara and Warren Senman from Minnesota State Mankato, Lane Bruner from Georgia State University, Juliet Dee, the University of Delaware, Glenda Ballas, same Houston State University, Sue Balter-Reitz from Montana State Billings, Susan Drucker from Hofstra University, and Gary Gumbert from the Urban Communication Foundation. Without further delay, I will turn the speaker's podium over to Linda to discuss organizational communication.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and it's good to kind of represent OrCom. I have a dilemma in that our major business meeting is going on right now, so and I've got several important obligations there, so I'm going to be ducking out. Unfortunately, we don't get our choice on how we schedule. Anyway, I'm really excited about kind of hearing some of these things because I think we've kind of realized about ethics and social corporate responsibility and basic freedom of speech is fundamental in a lot of what happens in organizations. And all we really have to do is kind of look at what's going on now with organizational downsizing and problems related to it, as well as unethical practices in banking and many other industries that are giving us difficulty. Let me say that in July of 2008, over 100 organizational communication scholars gathered at Snowbird Lodge in Utah to talk about what the field would be like in the next generation, probably 5 to 10 years. This was a revisit of a group that came together in 1981 that was really looking at how can we move the field out of kind of transmission models of communication and begin to look much more at meaning, symbols, co-construction of action that's happening, and look more at this, what we believe is the heart of our field in terms of interpretive processes as well as actions. And so communication came out of that as a kind of new way to begin to study and look at organizations. So it seemed fitting that 27 years later we would come back together and want to look at where do we want to go in the next era about making organizations more humane, trying to engage many more communities and stakeholder groups in organizational practices, and making our research socially relevant. So I'm going to talk about 3 broad areas that kind of came out of that conference and that I think is setting the agenda for the next 5 years as we look 5 years out. The first one I'm going to call the practice turn. And with the practice turn, what I see happening is many more scholars in organizational communication looking at problem-centered issues, engaging and partnering with publics around organizational problems and issues, and including a wider range of stakeholders. I think if you look at organizational communication, at first it was a container, and people talked and worked and organized and coordinated in the container. And I think things have changed radically in the last several years. A lot more work on environmental conflicts and the role of organizations in that as they interface with societies and other organizations. Work on homelessness, civic organizations, nonprofits, third sector organizations. Phil Tompkins' study of the Denver, Colorado Project for Eliminating Homeless is a fascinating study, longitudinal, long-term, on the way governments and organizations work together. Work on information technology implementation in homeless shelters, work on the Montana Work Project, and this longitudinal study about the whole transformation of work in the state of Montana as industries have changed. Brummins and Putnam, I work on conflict and multi-organizational stakeholders involved in the negotiation of kinds of policy actions. What I see in the next 5 years out of this is much more focus on communities of practice, on engaged scholarship. Who are our stakeholders? How do we tap them? What kind of partnering do we need to engage in? And which of all the many social problems we need to be gearing to, including disaster relief, terrorism, digital divide, global warming, a lot of those kind of things. A second broad theme of that work is the intersections of work and life. A lot more concern, again, blurring these boundaries of organizations. What's happened in that field is to do that and to think about work-life issues and elder care and the way in which our lives are in our organizations are in our lives, what it means in corporate America that we define our policies around work in a particular way. This also is looking at collaborative policies and practices, but it's also looking at gender differently. I think what's happening in an organization, gender is no longer a variable. Gender is a set of identities in which we negotiate along with our race, our ethnicity, our sexual orientation, our class, and how do these what we call intersections of self come to play as we look at work-life issues. And how is difference? What is difference and how does it work? Connected to this, I see emotion having a fundamentally more important role in the next 5 years. Organizations are not just rational places where people make decisions. Compassionate work, removing corrosive emotions, coming out of bullying work that's gone on and how to end this kind of process. A third thread out of this agenda is to look at international, multinational, global organizations. Much more about world countries, post-colonial studies, NGOs and partnerships. There's current work that people are starting to explore on clandestine organizations and terrorist networks as organizing processes, and what does that mean for the challenges our country's facing. A lot of this work has kind of a critical edge, but I think it's really looking at how we in organizations have got to be thinking outside of our kind of Western biases and Western approaches to what an organization is. So in conclusion, research in organizational communication seems particularly sensitive to the social science approach, which we call the practical turn. We've moved out of what we call the linguistic turn, or the study of discourse. We've spent the last decade studying discourse and discourse processes and the way communication constitutes both organizing and organization. We become more concerned right now to revisit what we call the materiality of an organization, the ways economics, objects, bodies, these things come into play in how we organize, as well as our symbolic meaning systems about this and our ideational views. I think we're also very interested in, as I said, this blurring of boundaries. I think we're going to look less like management and business, where we grew up from, more like a kind of organization-society relationships. I think we're going to be much more concerned, as I said, for work-life issues and the role of our own identities in the many, many hours we spend in our workplace. The overall goal is that we may have more diverse and accepting kind of workplaces, more ethical kinds of orientations, ways we can make not only organizations more successful and efficient, but ways we can actually affect the human condition in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Now we would like to recognize Warren Sandman from Minnesota State Mankato to give the freedom of expression opinion on organizational communication.
Well, thank you, Dr. Putnam, for leading us off here, and Debbie for organizing this here. One of my favorite writers is Kurt Vonnegut, who is such a good writer that even the grave cannot stop him. Dead 2.5 years, and he still published a new bestseller. In one of his earlier stories, Who Am I This Time?, Vonnegut gives us a character who is just that, a character. Left as an orphan on the steps of the Unitarian Church, that's the joke, by the way, Harry Nash, active in his local community theater, becomes whatever and whoever the script tells him he is. There is no I. There is only a collection of characters controlled by a script. So where am I going with this? In her presentation, Dr. Linda Putnam presents us with a picture of the current practices and future trends of organizational communication theory and research. And I have 5 to 7 minutes to describe how theory and research and freedom of expression will guide, constrict, shape organizational communication. Well, of course, I can't do that. But I can focus on at least one area of Dr. Putnam's presentation where ongoing changes in law and theory of freedom of expression will affect organizational communication. I'm going to look at how the law surrounding an employee's right to speak, because after all, employees are part of an organization, and specifically in one of the cases addresses the usually not-for-profit organization most of us know so well, the university. So I'm going to look at how that could shape what, or at least how, organizational scholars may study organizations and the individuals who are part of those organizations. And how does my story fit? Well, the premise of my presentation is that current trends in this area of freedom of expression, if they continue, will result in workers who lose their I, who are scripted in their public responses, and who will be only those public people allowed by the script of their organization. The first case, Garcetti v. Ceballos. Richard Ceballos was a deputy district attorney in Los Angeles County. He was asked by a defense lawyer to review a case to see if there are some irregularities in the search warrant process. Ceballos did the investigation, determined there were fairly significant irregularities, and being the good attorney he was, wrote a memo. His supervisors received the memo, decided not to pay attention to it, and continued on with the case. Ceballos was then called to testify at the hearing and, under oath, recounted his findings. Ceballos was subsequently demoted and transferred from his office. Naturally, he filed suit against the county, claiming a First and Fourth Amendment protection. In essence, that his employer retaliated against his speech and that his speech was protected. The district court granted judgment to the county, ruling that Ceballos' expression was not protected because he prepared it, at least in part, through his official duties. On appeal, the Ninth Circuit overturned, arguing instead that Ceballos' speech was protected. LA took the case to the Supreme Court, and the court overturned the Ninth Circuit. In its ruling, the court found that, quote, when public employees make statements pursuant to their official duties, they are not speaking as citizens for First Amendment purposes, and the Constitution does not insulate their communication from employer discipline. The court supported this argument with the following reasoning. First test, was the employee speaking as a citizen on a matter of public concern? If no to either of those, then it doesn't matter. There's absolutely no First Amendment protection. If yes, possible First Amendment protection. However, if there is a reason for the governmental employer to treat the employee differently than any other citizen due to the nature of the employment relationship, then First Amendment protection is less likely. In this case, the court found that LA County had a justifiable reason to limit Ceballos' speech. The basic test, is the restriction necessary for the efficient and effective operation of the employer? If so, then restriction is not constitutionally prohibited. So, in cases where the efficient and effective operation of the employer is found, an employee is limited in the script that he or she may use. Who am I this time? I am silenced. Second case, Hong v. Grant. Now, of particular interest to those of us who are employees of a certain governmental employer, the university, for example, Garcetti raised some concern, but not all that much because the court seemed to indicate quite clearly that the finding would not affect educational settings. A teacher's speech as a public citizen, even if it addressed issues relevant to that employer, the school, was still seen as protected, as the speech of a citizen who happens to be a teacher. Hong changed this perception. In Hong, the plaintiff was a university faculty member denied a merit increase in his salary because he was publicly critical about the whole process of hiring and promotion, as well as critical of the increased use of lecturers rather than professors. The district court's finding, Hong's speech was not protected. Their reasoning. The court, however, agreed with defendants that plaintiff's speech was not protected under the First Amendment because all of plaintiff's criticisms were made pursuant to his official duties as a faculty member. The speech was not protected from discipline by university administrators. Moreover, plaintiff's criticisms pertaining to the internal hiring, promotion, and staffing practices were of very little concern to the public because they did not implicate matters such as malfeasance, corruption, or fraud. The court concluded that it was not qualified to second-guess the wisdom of the university practices and that it was required to allow the university administrators wide latitude in managing the university's affairs in order to accomplish the university's educational and research mission. So who am I this time? I am a professor who has no ability to speak critically in public about the conditions of my employment. To conclude, what does or may this have to do with organizational communication research? Dr. Putnam notes that one of the main areas of new research will be the area of work-life overlap. What the courts are saying, however, is that in terms of at least what a person can or cannot express, there may be less work-life overlap than we think. Instead, work has overtaken our life, or at least our identity. Who am I this time? I am, and always will be, a loyal and compliant public member of my organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. I think you can see with the two presentations that we just had how, by looking at both the individual and the organization, the importance of the different areas of studies, whether it be the legal aspect, whether it be the social science aspect, that the study of organization is very important. Now we will move along, and Lane Bruner from Georgia State University will address the
Well, that was a frightening beginning. To know our courts are so eager to protect critical thinking. What might critical rhetorical studies look like 5 years from now? Or where might the conversations between critical rhetoricians, critical political philosophers, and subjectivity scholars be going? Rhetoric and philosophy have increasingly merged over the last 100 years, particularly in the wake of developments in semiotics, psychoanalysis, and neo-Marxism. Semiotics, as Kaja Silverman nicely illustrates, has moved from a study of language to a study of subjectivity, moving through structuralism and post-structuralism. Freudian and Lacanian perspectives on subjectivity have also influenced rhetorical theory, as have work by folks such as Laclau, Zizek, and Deleuze. In America, from Kenneth Burke to Michael Calvin McGee to Ramey McCarrow, we have seen rhetorical scholarship become increasingly focused on the inevitability of the power-laden dimensions of discursivity and the way that instead of us speaking language intentionally to persuade, in many ways language speaks us. This theoretical background has influenced work in collective identity construction, ideological criticism, and public memory studies, if being less influential on the predominantly intentionalist and neo-Aristotelian approaches to public address. In other words, it used to be in rhetoric that we studied how rhetors intentionally crafted messages to persuade audiences. Now we are increasingly interested in the way language systems frame our abilities to do that process. Still, I would argue that it's a combination today of these older intentionalist perspectives on persuasion and these newer critical perspectives on the constitution of the rhetorical phenomena in general that constitutes the field of rhetorical studies. Now, since my own work is less interested in intentional forms of persuasion, which to me seem to float on the surface of these deeper influences of culturally specific forms of common sense, ideology, what Michel Foucault called biopower, or the way we wear language on our bodies, I'm not going to really discuss what I believe the future of public address will be, but instead will limit my brief remarks on the future of what I call critical political communication, or the study of subjectivity, collective identity construction, such as nationalism or race, and ideological violence, which I would say, of course, the case studies that you just listed would be an example of. At present, in my opinion, there's a battle going on between various post-structuralist and psychoanalytic perspectives, such as those derived from the work of Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, and others, and this, I believe, is what Kathleen Farrell was referring to as the rhetorical turn or the discursive turn. And on the other hand, between those who follow realist, materialist, or pragmatist perspectives that, while accepting many of the tenets of the posts, are nevertheless keen to emphasize the materiality and reality by which various discourses can be compared. And I think this also resonates with Kathleen Farrell was saying, that we've now moved through all of these complicated philosophical perspectives on language, and now we're moving back towards materiality and reality, and that's hard to do if you haven't tackled the post-structuralist and psychoanalytic perspectives, because you're easily attacked of being philosophically naive. For the various post-structuralists and psychoanalytic theorists of critical political communication, whatever else one might consider objective reality is in fact a fiction, since the objective world, whatever it is beyond the capacity of language, which is fundamentally tropological and based on systems of differences that have no essence. In other words, there is no such thing as a real man or a real woman, because these are discursive constructions. The Lacanian real, for example, stands in part for the notion that that which escapes signification is that which is real. And Derrida famously turned structuralism inside out by arguing, very persuasively, that the center of any concept or discourse is an absence. Subjectivity, then, is a type of politically consequential fantasy, or an attempt to repress the fundamental absences at the heart of language and subjectivity. Now, there's a reaction to this that's going on, I believe, right now, and I believe over the next 5 years we're going to see an enhanced reaction to this perspective. The neo-realists, the materialists, and the pragmatists want to take the best insights of post-semiotic thinking, and yet, instead of drawing upon Saussurean semiotic principles, which is based on the analysis of language, they are more at home with Peircean semiotic principles, since they are based on the analysis of language in relation to reference. Instead of simply arguing that language is based on difference and absence, those following this perspective argue that the absences at the center of discourses are not the same. There are, in fact, historical material facts, and yet there is a necessary difference between these facts and the discourses used to represent and constitute them. While radical post-structuralists deny that language can even serve a representative function, neo-realists want to hold on to the basic Marxist principle, as variously characterized by theorists such as Herbert Marcuse and Louis Althusser, that the function of criticism is to trace the distance between historical material facts and the discourses or fantasies that constitute our subjective experience of those facts. My last paragraph. Despite the explosion of communication and transportation technologies, the world remains fragmented linguistically, culturally, religiously, nationally, and so on. Individuals find themselves thrown into culturally specific forms of common sense that are arbitrary, and yet they still oftentimes believe that what they arbitrarily think is true with a capital T. This is especially true with nationalist, ethnic, and religious identities. At the center of all such identities is what I refer to as the field of the unspeakable, or discourses that constitute the absences that allow the fantasized identities to cohere. And I believe that the near future of critical political communication and ideological criticism within the neo-realist position will focus increasingly on mapping these absences and diagnosing these different fields of the unspeakable. The excessive nominalism and relativism of the last decade that lurks at the heart of much of post-structuralist and psychoanalytic perspectives plays directly into the hands of neoliberalism and global capitalism, and it must be checked by theories of rhetoric that recognize that language functions in both representative and constitutive ways, and that the critique of subjectivity and collective identity must be blended with realist, materialist, and pragmatist perspectives, and that the best way to do this is to map the fields of the unspeakable at the heart of all identity formations to better distinguish healthy from unhealthy forms of hegemony. And this will have a profound influence, I think, on studies of resistance, transgression, and protest, especially over the next several years. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bruner. Now to have our counterpoint, I would like to invite Juliet D. from the University of Delaware.
So if we're asking this question, what is going to be the future of mass communication research, political communication research during the next 5 years, I'd actually like to start with a story. This is a true story. A girlfriend of mine was going to get married. She was Catholic. She was going to marry a guy who was Jewish. At the appropriate time, the best man welcomed all of the guests from both sides of the family, and he told them he was so happy to have such a diverse group of guests at the wedding, and he wanted to wish the bride and groom very, very well in their mixed marriage. And I'm so glad that I heard a little tiny gasp from all of you, because as you can imagine, there was just the slightest gasp that went out as everybody was listening to the best man give this speech. And then he looked at everyone with a huge smile, and he said, "Yes, I am talking about a mixed marriage. I have the greatest faith that this quantitative researcher can be happily married to this qualitative researcher." And I always think of that when we talk about the future of research, because I know at least where I am, we see a huge, huge amount of pressure toward only quantitative research, and those of us who still do qualitative research, I hope we can hang in there. I've heard an awful lot of committees that are hiring new faculty say, well, of course we have to have a quantitative researcher, and it makes me a little nervous, but there are some maybe larger picture questions as well. One of the things that I care very much about is the future of research in terms of freedom of speech, not only in the United States, but in other countries. During the last couple of years, we've seen, I think, a real horror story unfolding in Myanmar. We saw so many Buddhist monks being thrown in jail, so many Buddhist monks probably murdered by an incredibly repressive government in Myanmar. There were some attempts by people who had cell phones to take pictures and get video footage out of Myanmar, so we got a tiny, tiny bit of footage. I'll leave that example with you, and let me go across a lot of the world over to Russia. In the last 10 years or so, more than 60 journalists have been murdered in Russia. So when there are very, very brave people like these Russian journalists or like the people who took the video footage in Myanmar to try to get the word out, unfortunately, sometimes they literally pay for this with their lives. And I don't know if communication researchers can stop this from happening, but one of the things we certainly can do is to try to shed a light on this. One of the books that I always ask my students to at least take a look at, maybe not read the whole book, but there's a wonderful, wonderful book by a guy named R.J. Rummel. He wrote a book called Death by Government. And I know it sounds like kind of a funny title. He's actually pretty serious because he looks just at numbers. He looks at numbers of people that were killed by their own governments. And here we're really talking about genocide, by their own governments during the 20th century. So, for example, Mao Zedong, Communist China, about 60 million people died at the hands of the government. So Mao Zedong probably gets first prize. Joseph Stalin, about 30 million Russians died, many of them in Ukraine. Joseph Stalin gets second prize. Adolf Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Probably the Nazis get third. And then there are a whole lot of other countries where, the Turks killed 1.5 million Armenians. The reason that I mention this is that obviously this, I suppose we could call this quantitative research, and it's very, very important. But the other thing that I think is also important about Rummel's research is after he gives you all these numbers, he tries really, really hard to remind us that the one thing that we have in American society are these fragile, fragile civil liberties. We have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and he's just always trying to remind us that we need these fragile civil liberties to to make sure that we don't have a government that is totalitarian. He doesn't really care whether it's fascist or communist, but he says that totalitarian governments are the ones that kill their own people. And this brings me to another question. One thing I'd love to see researchers looking at over the next 5 years is what isn't published? What are we not seeing? What are we not hearing? There's a wonderful project at the University of I think it's at California State at Sonoma. It's called Project Censored. I would urge you to take a look at their website. Project Censored basically covers or tries to cover all the stories that might be reported once in the New York Times and then are just dropped like hotcakes. And since I know I don't have too much time, if we're asking where we're going to be in 5 years, the other thing that I'm almost afraid to say, but I think probably I might say, maybe we're all going to be really broke in the next 5 years. Because look at what happened to all of us with this recession. And to go back to Project Censored for a minute, just a couple weeks ago, public television put on a documentary. It was called The Warning. It was about a woman, I think her name was Marjorie Bourne. She was director of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission under the Clinton administration. She was really worried about derivatives. She said, we've got to have some way of regulating derivatives. And Alan Greenspan shut her down. So I'm using that as an example of the kind of thing that doesn't get reported, doesn't get published. If she had actually prevailed, maybe we wouldn't have lost our entire pension funds a year ago, because she was really literally trying to sound a warning. Another thing I want to talk about in terms of I guess let's say the next 5 years is just the future of political protest in general. We just heard from Michael Brunner. Michael Brunner has published a really, really wonderful book called Democracy's Debt. I urge everyone to read it. There was one thing that you talked about in your book about, and I think this is just such an important point. You talked about all the protests outside the World Trade Organization in Seattle, and you said, and it really caught everybody by surprise, which I think it did. So this brings me back to this question that I raised with regard to Project Censored. Why are we as Americans so unaware? Why do we not know what's happening, especially when it comes to things like multinational corporations taking over so much power over our lives? Why do we not know what the World Trade Organization is doing? And so this just leads me to the general question of protest. I am worried about protest just in general. I hope that we will never have another debacle the way we did a year ago at the Republican National Convention when Amy Goodman was arrested. We heard later that the city of Minneapolis, and specifically the city of Minneapolis Police Department, received $10 million from the Republican Party, and this $10 million was just to cover the police in terms of liability suits. So basically the Republican Party said, hey, it's okay to go out and arrest anyone you want to arrest. You can arrest the journalists. It's all right. If the journalists sue you for false arrest, then it's okay because we're going to pay your liability fees. Now, I think I'm getting a time cue, so I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thank you, Juliet. Next, we will have Glenda Ballas, who will discuss mass media and the future of mass media in the next 5 years.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. My research area is media studies, and today I'm briefly addressing 3 topics about how digital media and digital technology may interface with and impact freedom of speech issues over the coming 5 years. I have a background in public media and public media research. I'm currently working on a comparative and critical study of public broadcasting systems in Canada and the U.S., as well as a study of rural women privileging the voices, individual and collective, of female agriculturalists in the Southwest. I tell you this so that you'll understand that most of my work coalesces in one way or another around notions of the public sphere. And that actually drives the 3 points or 3 topics that I'd just like to briefly bring to the fore today. So here they are. 1, the pervasive accessibility for broad and open speech on the internet through email, blogs, web postings, and social media, among others, and the ways individuals' lives may be radically and adversely affected due to lack of protection and privacy in the speech zone. Students may lose a job interview, individuals may be sued for libel and libel per se, people can get arrested due to internet speech by themselves and others. And the examples of this are myriad. I just lost my screen. Michael Phelps, back in February, lost his contract with Kellogg due to the posting of an online photograph of him using a marijuana pipe. He didn't post it. He didn't know that it was taken. He was surprised, as was Kellogg, to find it there. In Albuquerque, one of the largest advertising agencies in the Southwest hires an individual full-time to research online content about students who apply for internships and graduates and other individuals who apply for full-time work, looking specifically at MySpace and other kinds of social media, and again, speech that's been posted by other people about them. And this morning, I learned of a really frightening story. It happened in the Midwest. It was reported in the Indianapolis paper about a new academic who went to a university in the Southwest as a provost, angered several people in a dean and chair's position and students, and a student created a blog and then posted erroneous falsehoods about this individual on the web. And ultimately a suit was threatened and ultimately dropped, but this woman was caught in a firestorm that she had nothing to do with the making. So speech on the internet grants us access to a distribution network, but limited assurance of protection, privacy, and accountability. I worry that the web will grow as a place for the monitoring and punishment of unacceptable speech, and it may concurrently produce a chilling environment in which some speakers are reluctant to participate due to fears of reprisal. And so I ask, in 5 years, where will we turn? And a part of this is tied specifically to the fact that the business model that supported the press for many years in this country is failing. And the internet seems to be the place where people think that they can publish and we can learn, but it's not a safe space for speech. And number 2, I'm interested in the production of video reports by private people who use cable and broadcast networks to publish their photos and short videos, a practice encouraged ostensibly by news outlets as support for citizen journalism, but increasingly as a way to acquire free content to fill up TV newscast and webcast. What seems at risk is credibility, information quality, expectations by the public of news judgment, and news authority on the part of the news programs and news as a social institution. And I ask where the credible expert voices needed to advance and inform society. I've long been a proponent, actually, of citizen producers. And my dissertation argued that public broadcasting's failings to connect with a broad audience was and is tied to a reluctance to let everybody speak on its quality text. Over time, however, I've come to believe that we need more quality information and more quality interpretation. A society genuinely interested in the public and seeking to advance the public good of the collective, of the common, increasingly needs more thoughtful sorting and gatekeeping of the gigantic, amorphous database that we all have access to on cable and the web. And then finally, I am interested in the potential for removal of face-to-face interaction in the public sphere as speakers increasingly use online oral, text, and video postings to voice their opinion in debates of the common good, of the public good. While these postings enlarge the conversation online, bringing in more individual voices, what is lost is deliberative discussions that can solve problems of the common. The distance provided by the internet allows a place to speak from, but offers fewer opportunities to actually lead on the ground, a void that is likely filled by the few, not the many. I acknowledge that I'm compelled by the town hall in Vermont, offered up by Dewey. I see it as idealistic, somewhat nostalgic, and something that's probably never happened. But I still believe that the work of the community happens on the ground with people who struggle over resources, may produce heated, unforgiving, and unforgivable discourse in discussions of the common good, and finally come to some negotiated consensus on the way to move forward. We need mechanisms to put more people into those small rooms in the courthouse, and I don't think the internal narratives produced on YouTube gets that done. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda. We will now have Sue Balter Wrights to provide the freedom of expression response.
Frederick Schauer, when he talked about justifications for freedom of expression, essentially the values, why do we need the First Amendment and what does it do for us as a society, breaks down those values into two types. The first type, the first reason that we have freedom of expression is to protect the speaker, to allow the speaker to create some sense of self-fulfillment, to have some sense of being able to participate. Journalism doesn't have these rights. The rights of journalists are inherent in the right of the public to receive information as opposed to the rights of the public to speak for themselves. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the credibility issue that Glenda addressed in her part, and then I want to talk a little bit about anonymity. And I think it's really important to remember that in this case, we're not really talking about do people have the right to post online? And I think that there is some importance in that, but what really matters, especially in terms of news and the production of news, and especially in terms of journalism, is what types of material is being disseminated to the public. And there are three cases that are of vital interest to scholars in freedom of expression that really get to the sense of what is a credible news source. And the court could care less what journalism schools say makes people credible in terms of news. What the court cares about is what is the intention of the news gatherer. In other words, if you are claiming to work and give information to the public, are you intending to disseminate it? And in three cases that are of particular interest, Schoen versus Schoen, von Bülow versus von Bülow, and In re Madden, the courts have said uniformly that really what matters when we're talking about what counts as journalism and who should have the right to disseminate news is it something that's going to be useful for the public? And there's two other standards that come out of that, but both of them have to do with, are you doing something that creates news? Are you creating content? And I think especially now when we have the implosion of sources of information with lots of resources. So what we have instead are media companies that are so conglomerated that there can be no critique on the culture that they are creating, that citizen journalism becomes even more relevant. And so the question that I think needs to be asked is not how credible are these sources, but how credible is the information that they are producing. And while that means we have to sort through a lot of junk, as Glenda argues, it also means that some of what's happening in the public sphere is actually, can't believe it, but it's like TMZ is probably the best investigative journalism source that we have right now. And that's a really sad statement, but media economies and the fact that media is, and it's always been a business, there's no doubt about it, but as revenues have shrunk, the expensive part of the media economy is the investigative journalism. I mean, it's high profile, but low profit. And those are the positions that are getting cut in newsrooms and in news production around the world. The second issue that I think is really important is the lack of face-to-face communication, as well as the anonymity of postings, and especially in terms of libel, and even more recently it's been copyright. And the courts are really just coming to terms with that. And there are two cases I wanted to quickly talk about those two cases, about the issue of anonymity. And the court is trying to determine whether it is important to protect the rights of anonymous posters online. And it's always a balancing. And there's two cases that have happened in the last year, one in 2008 and one in 2009, both on the district court level, that I think are giving us some leadership into where the court might be going. The first is Doe 1 and Doe 2 versus Doe 21. In this case, the U.S. District Court for Connecticut denied a motion to quash a subpoena from a dependent who had posted defamatory comments about a Yale law student online. The comments were all sexual in nature. Just from my reading of what happened, it seems like the Doe 21, who was a male, wanted to have sex with Doe 1 and Doe 2, obviously was spurned, and so increased the hostility online, was posting to a site called AutoAdmit, which is a bulletin board for law students and I think maybe some other graduate students, although it seemed like it was mainly used for law students, that defamed these women. So the Doe 2, I think, is the primary person, was able to show that she had met the criteria to pursue libel against Doe 21, and the court said absolutely. And so they required America Online, not America Online, I'm sorry, AT&T, to release the identity of Doe 21. And what's important out of this case is that it reminds us all that the CDA from 1997, which essentially gives Internet service providers immunity from liability from other people who post libelous material or copyright protected material online, also gives ISPs essentially free rein to determine when they're going to protect your anonymity and when they aren't. And that's essentially what this case said, is that AT&T had essentially in their privacy policy said, hey, we're going to give away your name if somebody has a legitimate case against you. There was a second case I quickly want to talk about, Quickstar versus Signature Management. Quickstar is Amway, and Signature Management was trying to lure away the Amway independent distributors. And so they were sending out emails pretty much bashing Amway. In this case, the courts found for Signature Management and didn't allow for the production of the name of the Signature Management folk who were sending emails to try to find out who it was who was sending the messages around. But what's important in terms of this is anonymity is still under debate. And so I think the courts are trying to find a balancing test. But overall, especially in the Signature Management case, the sense of this is that it's important for people to be able to create information that will instruct the public debate. So again, it comes down to that second justification, and that is, what is the quality of the information? And the courts have always thought that more quality is better than not at all.
Thank you, Sue. Now we will have Susan Drucker, and she will discuss the future of the world. Of the world. There we go.
You only got 5 minutes, too.
In 5 minutes.
That's easy. The future of the world in 5 minutes is go to my website, Actually, what I did was I took out a crystal ball, which no longer works, so I decided to just go directly to the source, which is www.crystalball.com. And so that my brief remarks come from that website. Actually, I just want to call attention to, I think, two major issues, one of which has already been addressed today, and so I'll make a short shrift of that one and really focus on, I think, fundamentally a question that hits all of us across disciplines, everyone in this room, everyone in this association. Because none of us, without freedom of speech, and academic freedom will be able to teach, research, or disseminate our work without those rights safely in place. In recent years, legislative efforts to regulate American professors have proliferated across the nation. As a legal matter, it can be extremely difficult at times to determine where First Amendment rights leave off and academic freedom rights begin. But in the interim, while we're debating this, we're seeing some of those rights whittled away, at the very least threatened. We can see, for example, that academic freedom rights are not always coexistent with freedom of expression rights when we're dealing with private institutions. I think the fundamental issue that we really need to deal with is that there have been a number of academic freedom issues that have arisen and are, I think, left unresolved to date. And I think in the 5 years out, we're going to be seeing further developments in these areas. The first area is that I think we've seen a dominance of the market and a reliance on partnerships with private companies. I think we've seen the corporatization of the academy, and that influences us in a variety of ways. Externally, conditions on university funding can pose a great threat. There are also, I think, increasing types of pressures by the government to regulate certain or influence certain university research. Within universities themselves, there's a perception among some professors that academic freedom entails a right to be free from all judgment, whether their perception would effectively sap the foundations of academic freedom or not. I think that these issues are being discussed. A second threat, legislation driven by anti-terrorist and anti-Muslim political climate that we live in. A more sinister international trend is certainly being seen with excessive control of power embodied in anti-terrorism laws. So we've seen, for example, in Section 411 of the U.S. Patriot Act, the concept resurrected of ideological exclusion. So exclusion of scholars, the refusal to issue visas on a number of high-profile researchers, excluding them from working in the United States. We've also seen a rise in the development of so-called academic freedom bills. These have been introduced in state legislatures from 2004 through 2008 in states including Pennsylvania, Alabama, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Ohio. We've seen academic freedom bills that have attempted to prevent scholars from using a classroom to talk about controversial matters. That's a frightening thought. We've seen this certainly in state legislation, but we're also seeing issues of private institutions where there are all sorts of codes being academic freedom limits with codes being promoted about what is appropriate and not appropriate to deal with in a classroom, whether, for example, political issues are appropriate in a classroom, and if so, which classrooms. Or there is increased discussion of students' rights and the rights of students to be free from being exposed to controversial issues. So I think that there are many academic freedoms that need to be tended to, both under the guise of the First Amendment and under the guise of its relation to academic freedom. The second area that I think we need to come back to is the area that was addressed in terms of the media issues, because I think we're living in an age of me. It's what I want in a classroom, me as a consumer being a student, and me, my media. I produce the media, I pull the media I want, it's all about me. Everyone today, as we've heard, has the opportunity to publish. Jack Balkin, who's the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and First Amendment at Yale University, has said that the great tension in the 20th century on free speech theory was the increasing protection of the formal freedom of speech against the background of mass broadcast technologies that reversed practical freedom to a relative few. The tension in the 21st century free speech theory is somewhat different. New technologies offer ordinary citizens a vast range of new opportunities to speak, create, and publish. They decentralize control over our culture, over information production, and over access to mass audiences. So we become the press. We are deputized. We've talked a bit about that. But I think what we need to begin to look at here is what are the rights of the citizen journalist. We see, for example, that in the last month, the language of the Free Flow of Information Act, which will be our national shield law, finally, has been altered. And so now we've redefined what a journalist is to include freelancers and online journalists. At the heart of the issue is defining what is the press. Is the press an institution? Or is the press and the Free Press Clause of the First Amendment really related to an activity that is being performed by all? Is it a personal right rather than an institutional right? I think that's an issue that we're going to have to deal with going forward. So both in our academic institutions and our media institutions, I think we have great challenges ahead. But the bottom line to me is that I go back to Kenneth Burke a lot. And the bottom line to me is to pay attention, protect, defend, nurture the First Amendment. Because without the First Amendment, it goes back to Burke, without whom not. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And to wrap up our discussion today, we will call Gary Gummert to wrap us all up.
I'm not sure what I'm supposed to wrap up because there's a kind of absurdity to this whole panel. I mean, we're in a room here with 8 people in it. We had 10 people in it. It has 200 capacity. We're being videotaped, but the cameraman isn't here. He's outside smoking a cigarette or something or getting drunk. And he would not have passed my production course because we sort of have a cover shot of the Last Supper here. It had occurred to me that we should all take our clothes off, and I just wondered who would be watching. I don't even know who I'm talking to at this point. I mean, you're supposed to know your audience, but I guess I'm speaking to me. So first of all, I take this title seriously. What would your life be like in 5 years? I'm not sure whether I'm going to be here in 5 years, but without freedom of expression, it may not matter. So I didn't know how to approach this. I've never been at a loss for words, as some of you may know, but I'm having trouble focusing here because I'm pulled in so many different directions. My Weltanschauung, my view of the world, has been fundamentally shaped. I mentioned this yesterday to another audience, that I am a German refugee, escaped from totalitarianism that strangled Germany 76 years ago. By the way, Hitler and I share something. I was born January 21st, 1933. I think it's on January 20th that he took over as Chancellor of Germany. So there are moments when I wonder about those events. I can't help but wonder. Particularly when my parents were alive, I asked them, what the hell were you doing there? Did you not know what was going to happen at that point? Hitler had made it quite clear in 1933 that German Jewish actors would be barred from the screen. And yet my parents were there, and we did not leave until 1937 and escaped from Holland in 1939, with the boat being sunk on the way back. So the question of expression and freedom of expression is one that I take very seriously, because my question then, and studying that period, my question is, what happened to the opposition voices? Were there no opposition voices in Germany at that point? What happened to everyone? Were they all banished, threatened, and killed? Could Nazism have happened if the communication milieu had been different? Could the internet have shaped opposing voices expressing dissent? Could a global broadband response have stopped the horrifying consequences that followed? Without freedom of expression, one is doomed. And yet, we're living in a period where forms of expression have changed. In the 21st century, there are a number of dangers accompanying the new technology. Make no mistake about it, I am a techno stud. I love the technology. But there are dangers that are accompanying that technology, the technology that shapes us. Genetically, I think 5 years is not enough, but I'm wondering whether 50 years from now, children will be born with their hand up here to accompany the cell phone, so they won't have to reach back and forth. In 1935, Sinclair Lewis wrote a very interesting novel. It Can't Happen Here. It's a story of a dictatorship taking over the United States. And the question that I have for us is, could it happen in 2014? Now, a bevy of brilliance surrounds me today, and I don't have the time for extended comments. So I'll simply make several socio-technological observations. Some have already been alluded to, clustered around two main arguments. The shift from push to pull, and the technologizing of community. As you very well know, we're in a city right now where the main newspaper is in deep trouble. Daily newspapers are on a decline throughout the country. Broadcasting is giving way to narrowcasting. National evening television news covers one or two stories, but beyond that, little but features of interest. And when something does happen, I was amazed by the Camp Hood coverage, because it was coverage ad nauseum. I know that's not politically correct to mention, but the rest of the world was going on at that time. And yet, nothing else happened on national television news. On the other hand, we have the rise of biased no-news networks. It's remarkable, the media of the right. But all is not lost. We have not lost the local, but we have gained the world. The citizen has the opportunity, but not necessarily the obligation, to be informed by what is going on the internet, and seeks what he or she needs to be self-informed. You know, some networks sponsor their usual service and cover the unexpected. But most of the time, national news is no longer pushed at the citizen. Now, that's a significant issue for me, at least. I always thought, along with Jim Carrey, there was a ridiculousness in the study of mass communication, that is, as a discipline. I'm sure I'm making some people quiver here, but I'm sorry about that. Instead, now, the citizen must pull what he or she requires. That trend will continue. And in 5 years, the migration may be complete, with remaining papers being digitalized and available only electronically. The citizen must seek and shape, must pull what is needed in order to cope in an increasingly complex and technological smaller planet. I speak and yet I lie, because in the morning when I get on, I go to the internet and I turn on the radio, and what do I listen to? My favorite music station in France, rather than my local station. I am truly a technological hypocrite. The digital electronic world provides us with global accessibility, allows us to transcend the shackles of space and place. We're able to communicate to anyone at any time, but have very little time for our neighbor. We don't even know his or her name. I challenge you to name your neighbor's name. Have you been in their house? We don't want to be there. We have the luxury of choosing our technology, and more precisely, we have the ability to choose our communities. In the process, the citizen lives by technology alone. Is it possible to be a citizen without connecting to a physical community? It's an interesting question. I contend it is not possible. Is it possible for an evil force to take over the digital world? Look at the demise of public space and the invasion of private space. I think one of the speakers today alluded to this issue. Where do you go to protest? The street is now an empty place. The mall is a private place. Without the right of the citizen, you are barred from protesting, from talking to others when it's not appropriate. You are under surveillance. So we have the mauling of public space, and I would contend also that the sprawling of America goes against the concept of being informed. There is no neighbor, there is no community in a sprawl. Well, I could go on with this. I'm generally the optimist, but I'm a little bit of a pessimist right now. In the best of all possible worlds, the internet is not enough. Freedom of expression ought not to be relegated to the electronic domain. 5 years from now, protest may have been shunted to the web, to the Facebook. Public gathering sites shifted over to the shopping mall. Disagreement banished from the suburbs, except for twittering and blogging. So I leave you with one question. Could it happen here? Thank you.
I think we all can agree that we've had some wonderful discussion today. And I want to take just a minute to wrap it all up and then open up for questions. After listening to all these presentations, I would say it basically boils down to, in the next 5 years, we're going to see a redefining of the collective and the individual, or the I. And we see that whenever Linda talks about and calls for social science to become more sensitive to the variety of stakeholders in its application of its study. And then Warren discussed the rise of legal protection in destroying what we know as I for the betterment of the collective. We also heard Michael address the fragmented world, which is full of arbitrary identity, which we then create ourselves. Then Juliet challenged us to look beyond what is readily available to what is not published, because that is where the voices are being pushed to. Glenda discussed that digital media will play a progressive role in shaping our lives, our speech, and definitely our action. While Sue pointed out that recent court decisions will shape what has to be considered as respected whenever we look at our sources and not to what the academic defines. Susan discussed the interrelationship of freedom of speech and academic freedom as it shapes the future of discussion on rights. But I think the most poignant commentary was when Gary basically said, "Who is our audience? I am talking to me." So I think if we were to wrap this whole thing up and say, where will we be in 5 years? We could very well be just discussing things with ourselves. So, questions? Yes.
There's certainly a lot to be alarmed about in terms of freedom of expression. When you look around the world at what's happening, the organizational dominance. It leads me back to Warren's examples. When you talk about authorities and scholars lacking the freedom of expression because it reflects on other institutions, what happens in the case of the news media when a scholar comes on and the logos of the institution are behind them? Now, does the institution then have the right to determine what's spoken?
We were just talking about that earlier, and in many institutions, yes.
They control the logo. You can still speak. You have to have your disclaimer there. I'm not representing the views of this university.
There is some
your logo there, you're in trouble because then you are representing the views of the university.
There are some universities where, in order to even give that interview, you have to get permission going through their president for
having the logos there is simply an advertisement. It's not necessarily a credibility issue, it's an advertisement.
Yeah.
Well, on the dark side, the other side of the dark side, there's two dark sides. Our faculty have had 3 computers taken by the FBI over the last 5 years. They just show up and say, "We're taking your computer." So we're also being surveilled in unbelievable ways.
There's a whole series of issues that you bring up. One of my concerns is that in the last 20 or 30 years, the property of intellectual property has become a major issue. Does the university own material that you put on the blackboard? What belongs to faculty members? And the problem is that unions have not taken a stand here, and we have not fought for the right of faculty to assert ourselves and say, this is my property. So it's a major problem.
Just a very quick comment on that. Most universities do not have unions or collective bargaining.
No, you just have done a good job of it.
No, but we do. And we actually signed away our intellectual property rights.
No.
Who's your bargainer? God said get a new one.
Other questions?
So you closed with the question, can it happen here? And you brought up Kenneth Burke. At one point in Burke's critique of Hitler's battle, he said it's not our virtues, but our vices that will prevent it from happening here. I see that as sort of linked to Brandeis, that the solution is more speech.
Right.
And I think the thread that runs through all the presentations is for every new opportunity that we have, there are positives and negatives, there are pitfalls that it's easier to be heard everybody's had a chance to speak, if with that as the question and the idea that not virtues but vices, that if we're going to stave that off, we have to put up with all the things we might not like, protect it all, because it's the difference, the volume that will stave off totalitarian thought.
Well, I was looking for another kind of vice, another way to, fight this. I'm in favor of as much voice as possible. I mean, that's one of the reasons I started my piece by saying I study voice and I'm looking to enlarge voice all the time. But I work now at a university, and we're helping students learn to be journalists. And I'm finding in that environment that there's not a lot of respect for the kinds of journalism that we grew up with and the standards of quality information and some way to, as I said, sort through everything. I don't know. I'm just thinking that there's got to be a way to make sense of this in a way that we can build a public and a place for publicness. And that's my whole point. I'm all in favor of everybody speaking all the time. Just would like there to be a place to protect the common,
but I want them to
work toward the common, and I don't see that happening without some kind of informed, interpretive, thoughtful conversation.
But they're speaking. They're babbling all the time, but they're not speaking to me. They're on their cell phones on the railroad station,
right.
On the railroad.
But I guess what I think, and this is why I agree with you, but I also think that we can no longer entrust the public in the traditional media corporations.
Oh, no. And that is certainly, that's one of the reasons we're in this problem.
And if
because it's market-driven and no small.
Exactly, and if the courts are protecting the corporations at the expense of the speech.
Luckily, they're not right now. They are Well, no, they're talking in employee speech. They are, but in terms of protecting people who are not employed by corporations to be news gatherers, the court has very much expanded the protection of voices of bloggers.
Yeah. And the Shield laws cover that.
No.
Now.